Cecil Rhodes, Christopher Columbus, and Brigham Young walk into a bar. The bar is theirs. It's always been theirs.
God told them so.
It's a colonization joke. Anyway, today we're going to be talking about Brigham Young, one of the most underrated yet successful colonizers in history. For those of you who don't know, I'm from Utah, and anyone who's lived in Utah for no small amount of time has heard and learned about Brigham Young and Joseph Smith. These two men are a genesis of a lot of Utah's culture and history, unfortunately. But oftentimes, outside interest is focused primarily on Joseph Smith, and for good reason. The guy was a character, and I mean that. Like, he reads like a fictional character. To me, Joseph Smith is like your generic snake oil salesman or the monorail guy from the episode of The Simpsons.
Well, sir, there's nothing on earth like a genuine, bona fide, electrified 6-car monorail.
Not a good guy, but he can sure make you believe in something, and he made a hell of a career doing it. Whereas Brigham Young is more like Mr. Burns. We're going to begin our story at Joseph Smith's death. Anything before is like a whole different video. There was an issue within the Mormon community. You see, Joseph Smith didn't have a plan to what would happen after he died. And I kind of get that vibe from Joseph Smith, like he was maybe one of the best improvisers in history and just made it up as he went along. But there's not a lot of longevity in that. So when the time came to announce a successor, there were two different camps. There were the people within the LDS community who believed in polygamy and those who did not. Who was going to take over? Joseph Smith's brother, an apostle, Brigham Young? There are a lot of people who knew that if Brigham Young or one of the pro-polygamists became prophet, that would solidify polygamy in the church forever. Emma Smith herself, Joseph Smith's wife, didn't want Brigham Young to be the leader of the church. There were even campaigns to sabotage Young's ploy to become prophet. Obviously, this didn't work, and in 1847, Brigham Young would become the second prophet in LDS history. Now, it is agreed upon by me and most historians that if Brigham Young had not become the prophet during this time, the LDS church as we know it probably wouldn't exist. And there's proof to that because after Brigham Young became president, there were little offshoots of the Mormon religion. None of them worked, except Brigham Young's main fraction. And Utah, as you'll come to see, is basically a state-sized testament to Young's success. And don't get it twisted, Utah is Brigham Young's success. Smith may have come up with the idea of a haven or a Zion for his people, but Young made that happen. And that is because Young was the opposite of Smith. If Joseph Smith was a handsome, charismatic, attention-seeking theologian, then Brigham Young was a fat, serious, ugly hard worker. Yet people called Young the American Moses and followed him just the same. Up until Smith's death, the Mormons had come across some harsh PR. You see, Joseph Smith had been kicked out of several states and pushed a few buttons along the way. And a few buttons of some young girls, if you catch my drift. Like I said, polygamy was a divisive issue, not even just among the LDS community, but in America as a whole. Many Americans saw polygamy to be as bad as slavery. And not only that, when the Mormons would settle a town, they often would hole up, exclude any other outside influence, and just overall be very concerning to the people around them. But Smith had spoke of a promised land for his people, where they could be their little freak selves. Also, it was in their doctrine. To quote David Bigler, author of The Forgotten Kingdom, The Mormon Theocracy in the American West, they believed the forefathers who wrote the American Constitution had been inspired by God to establish a place where his kingdom would be restored to power. The Mormons believed their kingdom would ultimately have dominion over the United States. And according to Smith, this desolation would come in the form of the brewing Civil War. In their minds, not only were they fulfilling the American dream to the absolute max, they thought, and maybe still do, that they were God's chosen people. Which is why Young is called an American Moses. Young had read descriptions of an area called the Great Basin and decided that area would be where he would settle his people. And this is for several reasons. One, Utah was and is a very difficult area to settle. It is a harsh environment. Therefore, there wouldn't be a lot of competition for the area. 2, it wasn't yet part of the American territory, so there wouldn't really be any disturbances. And 3, Utah has a weird amount of similarities to Jerusalem, or the OG Holy Land. There's a Dead Sea, the Great Salt Lake. It is a desert mountain terrain, and there's a huge river going through the Salt Lake area, which would later be called the Jordan River. But most important was the first 2. See, Young knew whatever he had to do in private, no feds. So he made west, and the Mormon migration is a lot like other American migrations, except a lot more organized. And that was Young's genius. He organized his migration in things similar to military units. He would make sure each group of 10, 50, or 100 had certain people that would help each individual train along the way. Carpenters in case wheels broke, people who knew irrigation techniques when they did get to Utah, people who could read maps, things like that. And not only that, he encouraged a community mindset, no man left behind. That means the stronger people in the wagon train, maybe, like I said, the carpenters, would always make sure to help the sick and elderly. But that doesn't mean it was all peachy. If you've ever played the Oregon Trail, the same issues still happen to the Mormon pioneers. Dysentery, death, sickness, caught in blizzards. It was not a good time. And by the time Brigham Young himself got to the Salt Lake Valley, he was sick, very sick, and he just pretty much said, "This is the place." And this is where Young really impresses historians. Like I said before, Utah is kind of a terrible place, and that's hard to conceptualize because Salt Lake has been a very well-established city for some time. But even as early as the 1980s, it was estimated that only 4% of Utah is arable land. Up in the northern end in Utah by Salt Lake, it can get well below freezing, and in the summer it can get to 100+ degrees. And in the southern part of Utah, it can get around freezing in the winter and well above 110 in the summer. Think about the logistics of that for someone in a wagon who's experiencing their first year in Utah. It would be really difficult. But how the church accomplished this was actually communism, which any respected member of the church now would probably deny. But it's true, Utah had a Stalin-esque quality about it. Mormons' first priority was the community. Everything had to be for Zion. The church owned all land, divvied out any private property, had the water rights, zoned the infrastructure, and when it was time to start building said infrastructure, it was important that that got finished first before the church would sanction any private homes. And when the time did come for you to have a private home, the whole community would come together and help you build it. I still think there's traces of this in Utah. I would be very interested to see how much of Utah the LDS Church still owns from this time. As it stands right now, I believe the LDS Church is the 4th or 5th largest land-owning entity in America. But this community mindset meant that settling happened fairly fast. If you've been to Utah or any Mormon-influenced town, you'll notice that they're all very similar to each other. The churches still are, to this day, very similar to each other. It's actually very similar to how a franchise like McDonald's build multiple locations. If everything's the same-ish layout, same-ish design, using the same-ish steps, the building or the town will go up a lot faster. Young had a precarious balance to keep. See, he was soliciting new members to come to Utah, and he had set forth mass migration. And knowing that he did that, he had to find places for these new members to settle. To do so, he would call members on missions, where he would ask certain families to settle the town. And it wasn't random. Like, he would make sure that a certain town had 31 farmers, 2 teachers, maybe a musician, a blacksmith. That way, once the town was built, they kind of had a ready-made community. But that doesn't mean settlers wanted to do this. Like I said, settling in Utah at all was hard. Imagine you just got your home in Salt Lake, you just settled in, and then Young tells you, now go do that again in the desert, all the way down in southern Utah. You wouldn't want to, but they did, because Young was the voice of God, and by proxy, denying him would be denying God. It's actually funny, the harsher an environment was that the Mormons were settling, you'd find that they were more communist. For example, Orderville, everything was community owned. The church owned all the resources, sold all the resources. You had to give 10% to the church so they could build the infrastructure. You only were allowed in Orderville if you swore to live piously and by the word of wisdom. In areas like the Salt Lake Valley, where settling was slightly easier, the idea never really took off. So these members were sent far and wide to settle. And this wasn't just the area of Utah. You see, Brigham Young wanted a kingdom called Deseret, and Deseret took up 1/6 of America's landmass. The areas that did get settled by Mormons outside of Utah to this day still have Mormon influence. You'll see certain towns in Arizona or Idaho that look very much like a typical Mormon town. It was Young's complete intention to settle and control the Deseret as its own sovereign territory. And imagine if he did. A swig on every corner, the extension industry booming, fry sauce flooding the streets. You too could be a Mormon wife. Of course, this wasn't just empty land. There were Native Americans in these areas, but the Native Americans were already part of Mormon theology. You see, the Mormons believe that the Native Americans are descendants of a group called the Lamanites, wicked people who denied the LDS truth and yada, yada, yada. In short, a lot of the LDS people believe it is their duty to convert these ancestors of the Lamanites to their religion. And some Native Americans did join the religion, maybe because they actually believed it, or maybe they just wanted the modern comforts that the LDS community could offer. Who's to say? Now, this could just be Utah propaganda, but it was generally thought that the Native Americans tolerated the Mormons more than the average white person. They called other Americans Maricates and Mormons Mormonese. And that is not to say that the Mormons were fair by the Native Americans by any means. At their best, Mormons believed that Native Americans were inherently wicked and less them. And at their worst, Mormons would massacre them, take their land. And this is because Mormons genuinely did believe that this land was their God-given right. And so any atrocities against these people were completely justified in God's way. And because Mormons were so quick and effective in settling, very soon after they arrived in a certain area, they would control the resources, thus being able to displace Native American people very effectively. To Young's dismay, he was not left alone like he had planned. In 1848, the U.S. won the American-Mexican War, and Utah and the Great Basin officially became part of American territory. Young petitioned for this massive area of Deseret to stay his sovereign territory, but the United States had a few issues with that. Like stated before, Deseret was a huge area that covered a vast amount of land. If the US agreed to let Young just have this, there would be a big chunk of resources that regular Americans would never have access to. I had mentioned communism earlier, but the actual governmental system that Utah fell under this time was a complete theocracy, which basically means the church controlled everything in Utah's government at this time. So, in essence, this would have been a massive theocracy kingdom in the middle of the United States. And don't get it twisted, this was a kingdom completely under Young's dominion. Some historians agree that Brigham Young's rule was the most all-encompassing government that to this day the US had ever seen. To put that in perspective, his power can only be rivaled by the absolute highest monarch in European history. Even when Young had to admit defeat and reduce his territory, he still ruled with complete power as the governor. Every single time during this period, a federal personnel would come to Utah to try to rein in the state or implement some, standard that would be similar to the rest of the US states, they would be ousted or just completely ignored. And this caused problems because, yes, eventually non-Mormons did move into Utah, and they very quickly began to notice that every government official was a Mormon, and every trial that would have been under federal jurisdiction was being ran by local bishops and things like that. And there was nothing any non-Mormon could do about this. You have to remember that to the Mormon people, Young was the mouthpiece for God. Any Mormon then, or I would argue now, would still defer to the prophet over some random federal guy. And when the federal government finally called for a removal of Young, Young basically just told them, no, shove it. I'll stop being governor when God wants me to. An air of us versus them became very apparent within Utah. And this is because the Mormons genuinely believed that they were being prosecuted for their beliefs and, not any of the other glaring issues. In 1857, American troops were sent to Utah to try to get a hold of its people. The territory of Utah was perceived horrendously by other American people. The whole Brigham Young king thing was an absolute turnoff. The whole marrying multiple people thing just absolutely disgusted most Americans. And this was because they perceived that these women were being married against their will as child brides. It genuinely was thought to be a perverse crime of humanity. And on top of all that, the Mormons were doing this little thing called blood atonement. If being a perverted, racist god emperor was not enough, Young was also vengeful and violent. Of course, this is all alleged because Young would never get his hands dirty. Blood atonement is essentially the idea that someone has sinned so badly that the only way to redeem them or save their soul is to kill them. And you may say, there's no way Young actually condoned this. There are sins that men commit for which they cannot receive forgiveness in this world, or in that which is to come. And if they had their eyes open to see their true condition, they would be perfectly willing to have their blood spilt upon the ground, that the smoke thereof might ascend to heaven as an offering for their sins. And the smoking incense would atone for their sins. Whereas, if such was not the case, they will stick to them and remain upon them in the spirit world. I know when you hear my brethren telling about cutting people from the earth, that you consider it a strong doctrine, but it is to save them, not destroy them. And that's from the man himself. There's no evidence that Young had ordered any blood atonements himself, but him even saying that just opens a can of worms. What constitutes a blood atonement? Who deserves a blood atonement? Who is supposed to deal out a blood atonement? All of this was unclear. Thus, some rogue vigilante justice was going on in Utah. You could argue that this wasn't Young's fault, but I would argue otherwise. You have to remember that Utah was supposed to be a utopia of sorts for the Mormon people. But then suddenly all these non-members are moving in, the federal government is getting involved, tell them they can't live their lives the way that they want to. There is no doubt in my mind that the Mormons would have felt emboldened to eliminate any contrary person within their community. The Mormons had fallen on some hard times. There was a locust plague, a drought, a general famine, and Young attested that this was because lack of righteousness within his community. He called for fervent upheaval and recommitment to the church, rebaptism, repentance, etc., etc. And if you couldn't commit yourself 100% to the church, or if you couldn't handle the fucking heat, get out of the kitchen. The kitchen being Utah. And if you can imagine that mindset mixed with the doctrine of blood atonement, it really was a recipe for some disaster. But Mormons are kind of a secretive people, so it's really hard to determine what was blood atonement versus what was just like run-of-the-mill Wild West violence. But there are some instances that reek of holy murder. For example, in 1857, William Parrish, a really high-ranking individual in the church, disavowed his belief and made way to leave Utah. And before he could successfully do so, his throat was slit on his front porch. So, or more famously, the Mountain Meadow Massacre. Fun fact, did you know the Mountain Meadow Massacre occurred on 9/11 and is often referred to as the first 9/11? The massacre occurred over growing tensions between the US government and the Mormon community as a whole. Young, around 1857, had created an army called the Mormon Militia that was 4,000 members strong. During the same time, one of the church's top members, Parley Pratt, Mitt Romney's great-great-grandfather, was murdered in Arkansas. And hearing the news and seeing the violence against such an important member of their community, Young declared martial law in Utah. And in some sort of twisted circumstance, during this time, a wagon train from, coincidentally, Arkansas just so happened to be moving through Utah on its way to California. As they traveled, unbased rumors about the wagon train began spreading throughout Utah. The Mormon militia gathered some of its members and planned to attack the wagon train in southern Utah. These people from Arkansas were not violent. They were not a military group. They had no real reason to incite this kind of violence. There were women and children in the wagon train, and at the end of it, 120 people, innocent people, were killed. Historians debate the actual reason to why the Mountain Meadow Massacre happened, but it's generally accepted that mass hysteria and us versus them rhetoric was the cause of this. But more debated is our main character's involvement in this, Brigham Young. And this is where things get a little murky. You see, if you ask Latter-day Saints, they would argue that this had nothing to do with the LDS Church as a whole, and that their prophet would never condone such an act. They often reference a letter received by the Mormon militia that attacked the wagon train a few days after the fact, where Young told them to leave the wagon train be. And the lack of direct written or solid proof that Young had ordered this attack is often exoneration for him, but where the LDS people will concede is Young's effort to conceal the Mountain Meadow Massacre after the fact. He was actively pulling strings behind the scenes and insisting and blaming the massacre on the local Paiutes. You see, the people involved in this massacre were very also high-ranking and respected individuals in the church, stake leaders, bishops, priesthood holders. This was bad PR for the Mormon church, and Brigham Young kind of treated it with that levity as just like a bad PR moment. But not everything could be covered up, and some members would be prosecuted for their involvement. The members prosecuted would be excommunicated, and one in particular, John D. Lee, would be executed. He believed he was a scapegoat for the church as a whole. Some outside historians have a hard time accepting Young's complacency in this plan, because even if John D. Lee and the other members of the Mountain Meadow Massacre did act on their own, is Young really blameless? Can you say Young does not have any blood on his hands? Utah was an absolute pressure cooker. The outside influence and the Mormon Reformation was just a recipe for a disaster, and Young was not a stupid man. He had to know the power that his words held. I'm not convinced that he didn't know and accept some forms of vigilante justice. Young was not a regular man to these people. He was the Word of God, and by proxy, God himself. If the people thought he wanted blood atonement or cleansing, he was going to get it. So at worst, Young is a leader who ordered and sanctioned this event, or at best, the complacency of a God king who's irresponsible and stirred his people up into such a frenzy that he was not able to control his own rhetoric, resulting in violence. I mean, but that's just my opinion. I feel to talk about Young, you also have to talk about his role in polygamy and how he interacted with it. Utah's history is so intertwined with polygamy, its eventual statehood, the culture of it, that you can't really fully analyze Utah without discussing it. Brigham Young wasn't the first to come up with the idea of polygamy. That was Joseph Smith completely. But Brigham Young did practice it and preach it to his members. And to be honest, even though I'm from Utah and have polygamous family members, I am absolutely fascinated by polygamy, and not just like in the Warren Jeffs crime way, but I have watched an ungodly amount of sister wives. Brigham Young was reported to have 16 wives and a total of 57 children. Young was ugly, Young was fat, Young was old. There was no way he got these wives because they wanted him like that. If you have these men who in both the LDS culture and the more extreme LDS culture are the only ones who are allowed to have priesthood, much less a prophet who is supposed to be the direct voice of God, tell you that they have a testimony even though you're 14 that they are supposed to marry you, how are you supposed to say no? That power dynamic is what makes this religious polygamy oftentimes so morally unacceptable. The power dynamic is just too insurmountable. And when I was growing up in the LDS church, a lot of times how this was explained to me was it was a different time. Though my issue with that is that human beings always have had emotion. And if a 14-year-old girl was told to marry someone 3 times their age who they didn't love and they kind of felt pressure that they had to, and then they had to pump out as many kids as possible, that's going to do damage to anyone's psyche. That person was still a person. A man who perpetuates something like that is a man who can never be exonerated in my eyes. And Young and Smith will never, ever be an exception to that. One of Young's wife, Anne Eliza Young, would write an expose of sorts on Brigham Young and polygamy, where she would claim rampant incest, child brides, and speak about the pressures that she felt marrying Young. And even though it was, quote, a different time, she was well aware that Young was too old for her. In short, she claims that Young wanted to marry her and she declined, to which he offered her life-changing money and a home, and even kind of threatened to cut her brother off from the church, which would be social suicide. That, along with the pressure she felt by her parents, because oh my gosh, how lucky was she to be chosen by the prophet, she just felt she couldn't get out of it. So she married Brigham Young. She talks about how his wives, despite him being the prophet, lived very poorly besides his favorite, and how little her and her kids got, how little he seemed to care about his wives in general, and how lonely the lifestyle was for her. Try to stop it as Young may, Utah had to become part of the US. They very quickly realized they could not survive as an economic entity without support of the United States. After the Civil War, the issue of polygamy really had to be tackled. Some members of the church really did not like the practice. Others saw it as part of their doctrine, making it a religious issue. People outside of Utah saw it as a humanitarian and civil rights issue, and coming off such an influential war that was about human rights, they were not about to compromise on that kind of thing. Young would die soon after, though some prophets still did preach the doctrine of polygamy, though it very clearly became an issue of Utah's entire survival versus this one doctrine. And if there's one thing that has kept the Mormon Church going for years, is their ability to change what they believe in order to stay relevant. Obviously, some members saw this as the complete PR stunt that it was, thus creating two sects of the Mormon Church, one being the mainstream LDS church that we see today that does not practice polygamy, and the other being the infamous FLDS church, in which Warren Jeffs is currently the prophet of. And in order for this to work, the Mormons had some making up to do. They had to convince America that they wanted Mormons as part of their citizenry. They had to make a complete 180. Even though under Brigham Young, separation was taught, the Mormons had to almost become ultra patriotic to avoid further ire from the American government. They began letting mining operations come to Utah, factories, military bases, as almost a way to say, like, see, we're just like you. We love America. We want to be a part of America. In fact, a lot of the things that Mormons are stereotypically known for today come from this ideal. Being hardworking, clean, pretty, white, family-oriented, wealthy, patriotic. These are all things that are now associated with Mormonism. Mormons were once these bizarre, somewhat violent outsiders and switched to the epitome of what it is to be all-American. This mentality of us versus them that was installed by Brigham Young so long ago, and the Mormons' desire to be completely enmeshed within America and capitalism as a whole, is currently what makes up a lot of Utah culture today as we know it. In conclusion, in lieu of Joseph Smith's large personality and impact on American history, an equally large figure, both literally and figuratively, is often looked over in American history: Brigham Young. While Mormons are definitely their own thing and own culture, they have a large impact on the American story as a whole. The West and Young's insistence to conquer all of it permeate throughout all of American history, not just Utah. Not only that, Young made Utah a very strange place to be in those early years, and in my opinion, set up a system that made Mormonism a lasting culture within America. So next time you order an extra large, extra dirty Dr. Pepper, enjoy some fry sauce, swerve along your extra wide Mormon roads, or watch The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, or see some missionaries knocking on some doors, you can thank your dirty uncle, Brigham Young. Yay! Hi, my name's Maddie, and this is Hobbs, and thank you for watching our video. If you want to know anything more about Utah history, feel free to ask in the comments, or just history in general. Thanks for taking your time out of your day, and we'll see you next time. Bye!